want to thank you all so much for coming out today. You know, the 2 Brown Bag series that we do each year, that's one of our most favorite times because we get to see you and we just get you in the library so you see all that we have to offer. So before you leave today, I want to point out that we have a few new pieces of sculpture. If you have not seen them, please take a few minutes to walk around. We're real proud of all the hard work that's been done through the summertime, and we want you to enjoy it. So I'm Tracy Thomas, the director here at the library, and again, thank you for coming out. I want to thank First Bank of Alabama for sponsoring the series. We're so grateful that they do this. That's why we have such great programs that are free of charge, and we love that. So I want to say Mr. Chris Kramer is back there in the back. Thank you, Mr. Chris, for being the representative. And please thank Chad Jones and Randy Fields on our behalf. And if you happen to see them out, please make sure that you let them know that you've attended and how much you appreciate these free opportunities right here in our community. And then I want to thank Miss Jane Henderson for coming. She's such a good cookie girl. She works our table for us. And also to the Hickory Street Cafe for doing these wonderful cookies for us. So we appreciate them so much. I also want to say thank you to Dr. Shirley Spears. She's in the back of the room with the Comer Library Foundation because y'all know how hard she works, and she gets up every morning with the Comer Library on her brain. Retirement means nothing to her, so we're so grateful that it does. And we get people that are the caliber of Mr. Billy Singleton to come to the library and do programs for us because she calls and asks them. So we thank you so much for Dr. Spears for all the work that you put into scheduling and getting us great programs. So I know that y'all want Dr. Ted Spears to open this program because it wouldn't be the same without him. But the first one, I always want to introduce him because he just, he's so humble and he doesn't, toot his own horn. But Dr. Ted Spears is one person in this community that gets up every morning, and when he goes out, the first thing he thinks of is how can I make my community better or who can I help today? And so I just want to thank you, Dr. Ted, for all that you bring to the community and for always being here to welcome the people to our programs. So thank you. And I will turn it over to Dr. Ted Spears.
Thank you, Tracy. That was a real good thing you did, and you can come back and do it anytime you want to. I'm going to start off kind of backwards in introducing him. I'm going to ask you to remember, do you remember a lady by the name of Ruth Elder? What about Catherine Stinson? So you see you got your work cut out for you. Those are the 2 women that Billy talked about when he was here before, and it was one of the most fascinating programs we've ever had for Brown Bag because it told us about 2 women aviators who in the first part of the 30s and the 40s made it took the opportunity to be the first pilot. So that was a great program. Today, Billy's going to continue that lineage, and we're just thrilled because the title, A Strange New Bird Coming to Alabama, the story of the Wright brothers in Montgomery. Had it not been for Billy, we have a tremendous history of airports and airplanes and air science and what have you, and he's keeping it all alive for us because other history is just, they deal with wars and shooting people and killing people, and we talked about something that changed the whole scene here in the United States and within the world, and that's transportation with the airplane. A lot of you can remember when you were in a situation where there's only a horse and buggy, and now we have jets shooting all over the world, and we've got that. But he is involved in the aviation industry for decades. He's a native of Alabama. He has a degree from Troy State University and a master's in aeronautical science from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He's chair of the board of directors of the Alabama Aviation Hall of Fame and the Southern Museum of Flight. He keeps the importance of airplanes and air travel alive. He has authored 5 books and 700 articles related to history in Alabama. And I didn't know we had that much. And Billy, for that, we appreciate that. And make sure the library has copies of all of that. He's a resident of Clanton. He's a member of the Arts Council in Clanton and the Chilton County Airport Authority, and a former commercial airline pilot. So turn off all your cell phones and turn on your attention, and let's welcome Billy back to Alabama. Ladies and gentlemen, Billy Heck.
Thank you, Dr. Spears. I appreciate that. Wow, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today, and I want to thank each of you for taking time out of your day to be here, to allow me to share with you what I consider to be one of the most interesting, one of the most unknown events in the history of this great state of Alabama. I also want to thank First Bank of Alabama. They've become a member of our community in Clanton, and they're a good member of our family. We appreciate them and appreciate everything you do. A genial climate and suitable grounds. These were the requirements that Wilbur Wright had in February 1910 as he began a tour of the southeast United States to select a site for the establishment of a spring training camp for student aviators. Now, for Wright, a genial climate meant an area having weather conditions that were mild and moderate temperatures. Because if you can imagine, in the early airplanes, the aviators were exposed to the elements. And in the wintertime in Ohio that we talked about, that could not only be tremendously uncomfortable, but it could be dangerous. Now, genial climate also meant an area having the right amount of surface winds. The underpowered Wright Flyer needed a little wind, little surface wind to help it climb into the air. But too much wind made the craft too unstable for student aviators to operate. A second equally important characteristic that Wilbur Wright was looking for was what he considered suitable grounds. Now, what that meant was that he needed an area of level terrain with no obstructions. So if you think about it for a minute, this flyer typically during training flights and most other time was operated at 50 to 100 feet above the ground. So even a stand of trees posed a dangerous obstruction for that machine. So he needed something totally flat. Now, before we begin the talk and the discussion of Wilbur Wright's journey to Montgomery, I want to take a moment to look back at how these remarkable brothers recognized the need to organize a group of young men to operate their extraordinary invention. Now, some historical texts will lead us to believe that Orville and Wilbur Wright were the first to fly. They were not. In fact, during their early experiments, they utilized data obtained by a German engineer, Otto Lilienthal, who conducted more than 2,000 flights in an unpowered machine from a hill near his home in Berlin. In fact, lighter-than-air flights had been made since the late 1700s, and even during the American Civil War, both armies used lighter-than-air ships for reconnaissance and artillery spotting. Now, what the Wrights achieved was very, very specific. Orville Wright would describe his first flight as the flight lasted only 12 seconds, but it was nevertheless the first time in the history of the world in which a machine carrying a man had raised itself by its own power into the air in full flight, had sailed forward without a reduction of speed, and had finally landed at a point as high as that from which it started. So pretty long definition, but very like the Wrights, specific. This, in fact, was the first flight of a powered, controlled, heavier-than-air machine. Now, although this event represented a remarkable technological achievement, the 1903 Flyer was not in any sense a practical airplane. The design was only marginally controllable and barely able to sustain flight. In fact, Orville Wright's first flight that day lasted a mere 12 seconds. and extended a distance of 120 feet, not much longer than the auditorium we're sitting in. The historical significance of the flight was that it was sustained, and I'm going to say semi-controllable. Now, following their success at Kitty Hawk, the brothers returned to Ohio and established a flying field at Huffman Prairie, near their home in Dayton, to conduct additional experiments. Now, during the next 2 years, they devoted their efforts to perfecting their machine. And it was not until 1905 that they were able to achieve flights of more than 1 hour in duration and actually do a complete circle in the air in figures of 8. And so the 1905 machine is considered the world's first practical airplane. Now, when they achieved that goal, the Wrights did something that made a decision that was interesting and in hindsight questionable. They stopped flying. They spent the next 3 years totally engrossed in obtaining the patents to protect their invention. In fact, this quest would ultimately consume the life of Wilbur Wright until his death in 1912 at the age of 45. Now, during the years that the Wrights of their aerial sabbatical, other experimenters began developing flying machines of their own, sometimes based on the Wright design and other times on new and improved technologies. Although these patent disputes, and they stayed in court for years, would not be resolved until being deemed in the national interest at the onset of the First World War, Orville and Wilbur Wright soon realized that competition from other designers had a negative impact on the sale of their flying machine. But more important than that, their flying machine design was becoming obsolete. Now, reluctantly, the Wrights decided to organize an aerial exhibition business to demonstrate the superiority of their design and to promote the sale of Wright machines. The brothers made the decision to train a team of aviators to travel throughout the country. They would attend county fairs, set new aviation records, fly in any public gathering for a fee, and they would also be qualified to provide instruction to the society sportsmen that could afford to buy a Wright machine. Now, because of the harsh weather conditions in Ohio, the brothers decided to establish a camp in the southeastern United States to take advantage of the good flying weather to train the initial group of aviators that would make up the Wright Exhibition Company. During his tour, Wright left Ohio in February of 1910 and visited first sites in Atlanta and Augusta, Georgia, and then moved to Florida. But he had not been able to find the kind of site that he really was looking for. So during a stop in Jacksonville, Florida, he met what has only been described as an acquaintance who suggested that he look at Montgomery, Alabama, known for its mild weather conditions and flat farmland. On February 15, 1910, Wilbur Wright arrived at Union Station in Montgomery, ushering in the first century of powered flight in the state of Alabama. Wright made his way to the Commercial Club, which was a predecessor to that city's Chamber of Commerce, and there he met the group's president, Fred S. Ball. When Ball learned of the purpose of Wright's visit to Montgomery, he immediately formed a committee to escort Mr. Wright to various locations throughout the city, including the state fairgrounds and the Montgomery Country Club. Now, although none of these initial sites proved acceptable for various reasons, Wright quickly realized that the area around Montgomery had enough flat, treeless land to suit his needs. The following day, Montgomery businessman Frank D. Cone read an article in the Montgomery Advertiser announcing the famous aviator's visit to the city and his purpose for being in Montgomery. Cone sent a message to Wright that he had a tract of land 3 miles square that he believed would please the aviator. The field was located 3 miles west of the city on the Washington Ferry Road. When Wright was taken to view the field, he inspected nearly every inch of the property in typical Wright fashion and declared it one of the best flying fields he had ever seen. Find that an interesting comment because there's probably no more than 5 in the entire United States at that time. In an effort to ensure that the Wrights selected Montgomery as the site of their training camp, Cone offered the Wright use of the land without charge for a matter of 2 months at least. The Montgomery Advertiser noted that Mr. Cone, having the capital city's best interest at heart, did not consider the possible damage to be done to the planted acres by the crowds that will go out to see the flying machine. Wright then visited the local weather bureau, where he examined the city's climate records for the past 6 years. While there, he discovered that the city of Montgomery averaged 1/2 of the rainfall annually of the other cities being considered. Additionally, he discovered the average wind velocity to be only 7 miles per hour, a condition that he felt was conducive to flying. Now, we will never know how much the influence of the flying field at Huffman Prairie near Dayton had on his selection of the site in Montgomery, but there are a lot of similarities that I thought was pretty interesting. First, both sites were similar in size, about 100 acres in total area. Both were located on major thoroughfares, the Dayton-Springfield Pike in Ohio and the Washington Ferry Road in Montgomery. Both fields were adjacent to a railroad, the Dayton-Springfield and Urbana Railway in Ohio and the Mobile and Ohio Railroad near Montgomery. And characteristic of the Wright brothers, both fields were isolated enough to offer a degree of seclusion. Establishment of the Wright Flying School in March 1910 led a reporter for the Montgomery Advertiser to exclaim, "The eyes of Montgomery are now turned toward a point on the Washington Ferry Road known as the Cone Plantation. In a few weeks, the eyes of the entire nation, if not the world, will be fastened upon the city." Montgomery business owners pledged to make the Wrights' visit so profitable as well as pleasant that the aviators would wish to make the training camp a permanent institution. Now, it's easy to understand why Montgomery business community was so aggressive in their efforts to secure the Wright School when we consider that the week Wright stayed in Montgomery, he received over 30 telegrams from business leaders in other cities trying to lure the school away, and they were offering much greater incentives than Montgomery had offered. Now, in addition to providing free accommodation for Wright and the students at the Exchange Hotel and transportation to and from the flying field, local merchants donated materials and labor to construct the first aeroplane shed to be erected in the state of Alabama. Located adjacent to the 3-mile post on Washington Ferry Road, the aeroplane shed was constructed by the D.F. Gorey and Son Lumber Company. To ensure that that building was ready for the first airplane to arrive in Alabama, construction was completed in just 3 days. Montgomery merchants were quick to realize the potential commercial advantages of being associated with the Wright School. Weber and Johnson proclaimed, "Our prices, like Wilbur, are right, but they are not up in the air." Now, this building, if other photographs you'll see, it was covered with advertisements. And I would point out, too, that they put a Wright Brothers emblem right at the top. When Wilbur Wright first came to Montgomery seeking a site for the training camp, he indicated that a dual purpose of the school would be to conduct further air work. Now, the machine that was brought to Montgomery for use had been flown by Wilbur Wright at the Hudson-Fulton celebration in New York City in 1909. On this flight, Wright took off from Governor's Island, flew over the Hudson River, or along the Hudson River, to the Statue of Liberty, circled it, circled Grant's tomb, and then returned. In the event he had an engine failure that forced landing in the water, you can see the canoe that he attached to the bottom of the airplane. This is actually considered the first extended overwater flight in United States aviation history. Now, the machine used in Montgomery was what we call a Wright Model A. It was patterned after the first 1905 machine, and it was powered by a approximately 30 horsepower motor. In Montgomery, Orville Wright made a significant modification to the flyer by installing a horizontal plane at the rear of the machine, which you see right there, to improve the stability and simplify the handling of the machine in the air. Now, Wright's first flight in Montgomery was the first time this arrangement had been tested on one of their machines. This modification would become the standard arrangement on future Wright designs and form the basis for the conventional airplane of today. Now, subsequent Wright designs after Montgomery would include the addition of this horizontal tail surface, wheels, and other modifications. That became known as a Wright Model B. So the Montgomery machine has been referred to as a Wright A/B or a Montgomery transitional. It was a very unique airplane. Now, when I do this presentation sometime and I say it's powered by a 30 horsepower motor, sometimes it's difficult to mentally conceive of what that looks like, so I want to show you. That's a 30 horsepower motor. So when I say it was underpowered, I think you can understand the reasoning. Normally, the flyer was launched by means of a launch rail and a weighted catapult system to help accelerate the machine to flying speed. Because the cone property allowed plenty of room for the flyer to build up speed on takeoff, the weighted catapult system was not used in Montgomery. Again, the first time this flyer flew without that mechanical assistance. And if you see, it's kind of in reverse. The flyer's taken off the opposite way, but through a series that weight would drop. And through a series of pulleys and ropes, it would pull the flyer and accelerate it the other way. The Montgomery Advertiser proclaimed a strange new bird soared over the cotton fields west of Montgomery Saturday afternoon. Orville Wright made the first flight of an airplane over Alabama on March 26, 1910. Wright made 2 flights that day, each of approximately 5 minutes duration, and achieving an altitude of approximately 50 feet. Now, since the flights had not been scheduled to start until the following week, only a handful of people were on hand to witness this historic event. So few were there that the reporter for the Montgomery Advertiser was able to include the names of all 8 of them who witnessed the flight. Now, although Wilbur Wright initially indicated that both he and his brother Orville would operate the school, Orville Wright assumed responsibility for operation of the Montgomery training camp, and the brothers were never in Montgomery at the same time. Many spectators felt that Wright and his students appeared to be addressed more for a church service than for flying. Weather conditions permitting, the school operated daily, except for Sunday, the day set aside for observance of the Sabbath and rest. Because Orville and Wilbur Wright had been raised in an environment of strong moral values, aviators of the Wright Exhibition Company were forbidden from drinking, gambling, and even flying on Sunday. One of the most remarkable characteristics of the Wright brothers was their ability to solve complex problems with simple solutions. For example, the Wright transitional, Wright AB, like the others, had 2 big propellers driven by a single motor. Now, if these propellers rotated in the same direction, it created handling problems and stability problems for the flyer. So they had to design a system to where those propellers would counter-rotate. So instead of designing this complicated system, what they did was just twist the chains and make the other propeller go in reverse. A very, very simple solution to a complex aerodynamic problem. Now, in looking at this image, have you noticed anything, and I know it's quick, anything that's missing? And if you don't, real quick, I'll point it out. The last time you were on an airliner, do you remember the safety briefing, please keep your seatbelt securely fastened around you? You'll notice there's nothing. when we considered that this airplane, the undercarriage was skids, not wheels, that made every landing a quick stop. And so early aviators, that was one of the biggest causes of injuries as they were thrown out of the seats on landing. The other thing I want you to look at, these seats have been referred to as tombstone seats. Now, I don't know if that's a comment on the shape of the seat or a comment on the state of flying machines in 1910, but I think either one would be appropriate. Now, this image reminds me of a story related by Wright student Walter Brookings regarding a typical mechanical event that occurred during one of the early flights in Montgomery. And this is Walter Brookings here and Orville Wright here. Walter Brookings had grown up in the bicycle shop in Dayton, and so a longtime member of the Wright group. According to Brookings, the machine that Orville taught me to fly was the same one that Wilbur flew in France. The airplane had been flown quite a few hours, and on one of our first flights, the chain that ran from the wing warp control over the tin-covered leading edge of the wing to the rear beam broke, and we were without lateral control. But Orville, by his clever handling of the plane, avoiding a turn and going straight ahead, landed us safely just about 10 feet from a barbed wire fence. Now, this chain was just an ordinary bathtub chain. And the constant moving back and forth over the piece of tin on the leading edge of the wing had worn it knife-edge thin before it broke. Right there, we increased the safety of flying by replacing that bathtub chain with a bicycle chain. So I've often wondered if the Wrights put out a recall notice to the other machines they had flown to have that bathtub chain replaced with a bicycle chain. Brookins also described one of his first flights alone in the machine. After I'd completed approximately 2 hours of instruction in the air, Orville turned me loose on my first solo flight, and to my consternation, the motor cut out, and I had to make a forced landing, which I did successfully. And I would say that Brookings, when he writes, he doesn't use periods a lot, so please pardon me, which I did successfully thanks to the training I received from Orville, who had been very painstaking in teaching me not only to fly, but the reason and theory of flying. After Orville once taught one something, it was so thoroughly explained and demonstrated that you never forgot it. Now, as you can imagine, operation of the flyer was very, very labor intensive. In this image, student aviator Spencer Crane lubricates the drive chain mechanism of the flyer. Now, I think most of you, like me, grew up riding bicycles, and for whatever reason, guys used to always like to take the chain guards off because it looked better. But we'd oil the chain and then go ride around and then have to explain to your parents why you've got oil all over those nice clothes they just bought you. Well, you can imagine the same thing because these chains are rotating right next to the pilot's seat, and you can imagine how they looked after time in the air. Now, I'm looking at this image. Passenger comfort was obviously not a priority. You've got a pilot's seat sitting right next to the engine, the fuel tank, and the radiator. And you can imagine sitting also in front of those two big propellers turning right behind you. In addition to being trained to operate the flyer, students of the Wright School learned to maintain and repair the machine. The wing structure was covered in a muslin fabric. This covering would easily tear when operating in tall weeds and cotton stalks, and so repairs were frequently required. I also point out the tongue and groove construction, if you can see it, of the entire aeroplane shed, as they called it. Wilbur Wright required that to prevent moisture from damaging the machine. The propellers were produced by hand in the Wright shop in Dayton and measured 8 feet from tip to tip in length. Now, spectators utilized various means of travel to the flying field. Some traveled by foot, some by horseback, and some by horse-drawn carriage. And I love this picture for that reason. You can see the white steamer automobile that the Wrights have been given to travel to and from the Exchange Hotel, and then the horse-drawn wagons and buggies, and of course, the airplane in the hangar. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad offered shuttle service to and from the city 4 times each day. The fare for the trip was 25 cents. In fact, on May 5th, 1910, 970 spectators took advantage of the shuttle service to the field. The following day, the Montgomery Advertiser reported it was estimated that there were nearly 3,000 people at the camp today to watch the aerial flights. And I would point out too, you can see where D.F. Gorey and Son were bragging a little bit about, erected by D.F. Gorey and Son in 3 days. Now, ironically, a conflict soon arose between the oldest and newest forms of transportation, as the horse and the airplane could not peacefully coexist. It became necessary for spectators to leave their horses on the Washington Ferry Road because the noise of the airplane spooked the horses, and that created a potential for damage to the flying machine and injury to the spectators. Now, when flying solo, aviators use the left seat to offset the weight of the motor. And the aviator would use the left hand to adjust the pitch or the nose up and down of the machine. Use the right hand to operate the wing warp control for maneuvering or turning. So consequently, you were known as a right-hand aviator. The instructor would sit on the left, had a pitch control in the right hand, but operated the wing warp control with the left hand. And instead of being referred to as a teacher or instructor, you became a left-hand aviator. Now, Walter Brookings, a longtime friend of the Wrights, became the first aviator to learn to fly in Alabama. Brookings was also trained as a left-hand flyer, qualified to teach other students. Once qualified, Orville placed him in charge of the school. This made Walter Brookings the first specifically trained flight instructor in Alabama and possibly the United States. Now, Brookings and Archibald Hoxsey, which is here, also completed one of the first recorded night flights in aviation history on May 25, 1910. In an attempt to take advantage of calm winds that would create better flying conditions, the duo conducted 10 to 15 flights that night, each lasting approximately 20 minutes. In a poetic description of the event, a reporter for the Montgomery Advertiser wrote, "Not a cloud in the sky and not a breeze was stirring. The weather was ideal. The moon, shining big and full, gave full view of the airplane, whose dark bulk throbbed through the air. The explosions of the gasoline engine marked by tiny sparks. Now and then, the exhaust would scatter a trail of sparks behind the aeroplane in its rapid flight in midair." Now, the exhibition business would prove to be very financially lucrative for the Wrights. For example, in October 1910, Wright exhibition pilot Philip Parmalee was contracted to appear at the Alabama State Fair in Birmingham. For the 6-day contract, the Wrights were compensated $4,000 plus expenses, a hefty sum in 1910. Wright exhibition aviators were paid $20 a week and $50 for each day they flew. However, they were responsible for paying the cost of treating any injuries they suffered during their performances. So the Wrights obviously didn't offer an employee health plan. Hoxsey would become the first pilot to fly a United States president, Theodore Roosevelt. And to put this in perspective, this is just literally weeks after he's learned to fly. He would also set numerous aviation records during his brief career as an exhibition pilot. He would also die in a Wright machine before the end of the year. Now, although the exhibition business was very profitable, the flying machine proved to be so hazardous that 5 of the original 9 Wright pilots were fatally injured in accidents. Because of the number of members killed in accidents, the Wrights decided to abandon exhibition flying in 1911. In her book, Wings of Opportunity, The Wright Brothers in Montgomery, Alabama, author Julie Williams suggests the Montgomery business community recognized the flying school of the Wright brothers as an opportunity to change the negative image of the Civil War South and to promote the city of Montgomery as a forward-thinking, progressive location for the establishment of business enterprises. This 1912 postcard appears to promote the same idea. You can see people walking, horse-drawn carriages, automobiles, even the lightning route of the electric trolley system at Montgomery, and of course, the airplane. I would add that this is a very, very accurate depiction of the Wright machine that flew at Montgomery, although it was never operated over the city. By May 1910, good flying weather had returned to Ohio and the Midwest. And in the words of the Montgomery Advertiser, with the coming of summer, Wright's aeroplane, like all other birds, will fly northward. At the end of May 1910, the Wrights closed their school in Montgomery and returned to their flying field at Huffman Prairie near Dayton. The Wright flyer used in Montgomery was shipped directly to Indianapolis in preparation for the first aerial demonstration of the Wright exhibition team. Today, the sole reminder of the 100-acre cotton field that once was the site of the nation's first civilian flying school is a modest stone marker on the grounds of Maxwell Air Force Base. And a word of advice, do not under any circumstances walk around an Air Force base with a camera without permission, because I can assure you asking forgiveness is not as easy as asking permission. With his departure from Montgomery, Orville Wright hinted that Montgomery could become a permanent flying center. Wright's words would prove to be prophetic. Less than 1 decade later, the same factors that brought the Wright brothers to Montgomery, a genial climate and suitable grounds, would provide the foundation for the establishment of military aviation in the city. In 1917, Orville Wright stated, "When my brother and I built the first man-carrying flying machine, we thought we were introducing into the world an invention which would make further wars practically impossible." It is ironic that Orville Wright made this statement at approximately the same time Army inspectors were in Montgomery seeking a suitable location to establish a training field for military aviators. Taylor Field in the Pike Road community became one of 14 primary flight training facilities in the United States. More than 200 training aircraft were based at the field. Training operations began in November 1917 and continued until the signing of the armistice the following year. And this is just to give you an idea of what the training machines look like, the Curtiss Jenny and the Aviator of the day. The combination of underpowered training aircraft and inexperienced student aviators resulted in numerous accidents. But in researching some of this, I came across one accident that was especially notable that I thought you might enjoy hearing about. 2 aircraft from Taylor Field collided in midair near Montgomery while competing for the attention of a young Montgomery socialite, Zelda Sayer, by doing aerial stunts near her home. And that was a big newspaper event of the day. Less than a decade after the Wright Flying School closed, the aviation section of the United States Signal Corps established an aviation and repair depot on the same parcel of land previously used by the Wright brothers. And this is the only time I've ever seen that parcel of land referred to as Wright Field in any military archives. The former flying field of the Wright brothers would become an aviation repair depot that supported Taylor Field and other aviation training fields in the southeast United States. And you can see here how Washington Ferry Road has been rerouted to accommodate the larger flying field. The original Wright School would have been, and hangar would have been right in that area right there. In the years preceding the Second World War, the former site of the nation's first civilian flying school had evolved into a system of continuing education for officers of Army aviation, the Air Corps Tactical School. Graduates of the tactical school assumed positions of leadership that would lead the Allied forces to achieve aerial supremacy during the Second World War. In fact, of 320 general officers on active duty at the end of the Second World War, 261 were graduates of the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field. During the Second World War, so many pilots, navigators, and bombardiers received training at Maxwell Field that cadets were fond of saying, "The road to Tokyo leads through Maxwell Field." During the war, more than 100,000 aviation cadets received training at Maxwell Field alone. During that period, the skies over Montgomery were described as having the densest air traffic in the entire world. In slightly more than 3 decades, the skies over Montgomery had evolved from a single flying machine of the Wright brothers over the cotton fields west of the city into formations of the most advanced military aircraft in history. For more than a century, the parcel of land used by the Wright brothers has been dedicated to aviation and aerospace education. Today, Maxwell Air Force Base is home to Air University, the Center for Development of Aerospace Doctrine, and more than 30 professional schools. In March 1910, the promise of a genial climate and suitable grounds brought the Wright brothers and the nation's first civilian flying school to Montgomery. More important than the climate or terrain, they discovered a city deeply committed in its support of aviation. More than any other factor, this level of commitment will ensure the legacy of aviation in Montgomery and the state of Alabama during the second century of powered flight. Again, I thank you for sharing that with me this afternoon. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I guess we got a few moments for questions if there may be any. Wilbur died of, they attributed a lot of things to typhoid back in the day, but Wilbur died at 45 of typhoid, and Orville lived a long age. He died of natural causes in his 80s.
They went to Augusta, Georgia, and Florida first. Where does Kitty Hawk, North Carolina fit in?
The question was, how does Kitty Hawk, North Carolina fit into this equation? It's a great question. Remember that they did some very early calculations in Dayton, but because they needed the assistance of the wind to help lift the machine, they did a lot of research and determined that the wind conditions that they needed would be found at Kitty Hawk. And they did several years of unpowered experiments because the whole issue was how to control this thing once you got it in the air. And that's what all the subsequent lawsuits were about. That's what they were patenting, not the airplane. They looked at it as our control system. Every airplane's going to have it, so consequently, we have a patent on every airplane. But when they went there in 1903, it was the first time they attempted a flight under power. And so when Orville said it was the first time that it took off and landed at a point as high as that from which it started, they laid out a rail and accelerated into a 20-mile-an-hour wind to help lift the machine and flew it forward. All their experiments part of that were down the side of a sand dune to gain speed to perfect their control system. Yes, sir.
There's some other aircraft development within Alabama other than the Wright brothers?
Great question, and I'd like to come back and do that presentation one day. There were four experimenters, and 2 of which had actual patents on flying machine designs one of which was very unique. It was very unique. Now, having said that, there have been some claims that they actually flew, but I try to compare apples to apples. And in one particular case, the narrative was that they started down a hill in a pasture, hit a bump, the airplane became airborne for a few minutes, then rolled over on a wing and crashed. So if you compare that to what Orville said they did, they're not the same. But that's not to take anything away from them, because I've tracked aviation experiments back in Alabama to about 18, just prior to the Civil War. And so, yeah, there were 4 very well-known inventors that, uh, 2 of which held patents on flying machines. Yes, ma'am. World War II, or just leading up to World War II. And it was, I'm not, obviously I think pilot comfort has something to do with it, but it's more aerodynamic. Because if you look at what the Wrights were doing, there's one of the aerodynamic forces you have to come to go forward is to overcome drag from all those wires and anything protruding into the airflow. So they started looking at enclosed cockpits to streamline that airflow around the airplane to increase the speed. Yes, sir. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad, which the railroads played a huge role in this. During the time in Montgomery, they would actually, one time, there's a story that they broke a propeller, and Orville had to go back to Ohio to retrieve a propeller. So it was one of the times that Brookings and Hawks and some of the other students, they would drive around Montgomery and see the sights, but everything had to come by train. Yes, sir. Well, that was the big issue. See, the Wrights, they stayed with wing warp. Essentially, it did the same thing, but they would actually warp the surface of the wing to make it turn. And other designers, Glenn Curtiss specifically, and in Europe developed the aileron. And so that's what drug the lawsuits out for years. Did one patent cover both? And the courts never could decide. But yes, Europe started using, I think, if I'm not horribly mistaken, aileron is a French term. And so they were being used overseas. And that's why I was saying the Wrights were becoming almost obsolete because they would not change their design. Yes, ma'am.
Alabama has 2 claims to fame for air because you have the Wright brothers
Mhm.
down here, and you have the Tuskegee.
You absolutely do. You absolutely do.
Very near to where the Montgomery Air Base is, and I wonder if there was any collaboration there because it's the Tuskegee Airmen that provided the protection for the bombardiers during the World War II.
Looking back and regretfully, Tuskegee was almost operating, I hesitate to say in a vacuum, but they were right there. That was a unique, incredible operation. I've studied, in fact, we're about to put a historic marker down near there. One, I won't get off the subject too much, but you may remember the story that Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady of the United States, flew out of Kennedy Field down there. We're going to put a historic marker there next month to recognize that fact. So tremendous stories. But at the time that the Wrights were here, that was not even conceived of by anybody. So it was, I think, one of the greatest stories in our history. Absolutely. And I've walked around down there for hours and hours and hours looking and studying that. And it's a great story. I hope that we can someday preserve the actual Tuskegee Army Airfield. We preserve Moton Field, and we're trying to preserve Kennedy Field, but that big base is rapidly disappearing before our eyes. Yes, sir.
Begin the new industry for propellers?
I'm sorry?
Did they begin a new industry to make propellers?
No, they produced parts only for their own machine. And after Wilbur died, Orville, the Wright company continued for a little while, but then it was bought out by, guess what, Glenn Curtiss, and it became Curtiss Wright. Orville seemed to just not have the enthusiasm that he did when Wilbur was alive. And I don't think Orville, if he flew after Montgomery, it was few and far between, because he stopped pretty quickly and started doing research in other areas. It just seemed to, Wilbur's death and the problem with the lawsuits just really kind of took his enthusiasm away. And so, no, he didn't do anything else other than some instrumentation in airplanes later. He didn't do much with aviation. The Wrights. Uh, it would have had to been an exhibition, but I don't know other than when they were. Oh, Kitty Hawk. You mean just east of Charlotte? Their experiments. Well, they flew out of Kitty Hawk just east of Charlotte on the coast starting in 1900, and they had their successful flight in 1903. But I'm not aware of them specifically flying out of Charlotte, unless they were there for an exhibition of some type, which is very possible. Well, again, thank you so much. You've been a great group, and I appreciate the opportunity to come speak.
Thank you, Mr. Billy. He does such a good program, and we're so glad that he'll come, and we hope you will come back and do another story with us. I know Dr. Spears has already hit you up during lunch for that, so we hope to have you back again. I want to let you know, if you're already aware, but you may not be aware, we record these programs. So if you see something and you think, hey, I wish we could go back and listen to that again, or I wish I could tell somebody about that, Sarah and Sam takes great pictures. Sarah's in the back recording, and they record these. They live stream them on our Facebook page, but they also record them, and then they post the links to our YouTube page. So if you ever want to direct somebody to that, and we have a lot on archives on there, so if you want to just go through and look sometime and see if there's something you want to rewatch, please feel free to do that. Again, thank you so much, Mr. Billy, for your great program. Next week we have Kari Allen Lee, and he's a resident right now at the Center for the Arts and Humanities in Auburn, and so he is going to be here. He is a phenomenal saxophonist, and he has toured with Aretha Franklin and Stevie Wonder. And so Mark Wilson called and said, hey, would y'all like to have him come down and do a program? He's going to bring some of his music students with him. So it's going to be a phenomenal program. And we're so excited to get the chance to have him to come here. So again, thank you so much to our sponsors and all the people that made today possible. Thank you so much, Mr. Billy. And thank you so much for being here. And we will see you next week. Okay.